Hello, and good afternoon, or good morning to some of you who are on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Reducing Demand for the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Minors in Your Community. My name is Adam Ash, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those of you wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenter will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. Please go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people joining you today. If you're viewing alone, there's no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdp.org, where you can also view our past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Kelly Renessian from NCJ FCJ to begin today's webinar. Kelly?
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is Kelly Renessinger, Senior Program Attorney at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges in Reno, Nevada. We are so excited to have you here today for Reducing Demand for the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Minors in Your Community. I'm just looking through the chat box, and we have such a wonderful diversity of participants coming to this webinar. We have, at this point, over 400. And I'm very honored to introduce our faculty for this webinar, Mr. Val Ritchie. Mr. Ritchie has such a wealth of experience. He's a King County Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney working in the Special Assault Unit. He's a Senior Trial Attorney in that unit, responsible for prosecuting CSEC cases. He's also one of the 2 coordinators for the Ending Exploitation Collaborative, which is a multi-sector partnership in King County to end commercial sexual exploitation. He's done numerous trainings and briefings on sex trafficking and exploitation for law enforcement, service providers, policymakers, and he also serves on the Washington State Commercial Sexual Exploited Children and Trafficking Persons Coordinating Committees. We are so very happy to have him with us today. One thing I would like to mention is that as you will undoubtedly have questions throughout this webinar, please just type them into the chat box, and I'm going to be keeping track of these participant questions, and we're going to be have an opportunity to address those questions further on in the presentation. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Ritchie.
Thank you, Kelly. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Once again, my name is Val Ritchie. I'm a prosecutor for the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office in Seattle, Washington. And today I want to talk about some strategies to end commercial sexual exploitation. And that title is very intentional because I think a lot of us find ourselves in a position of merely trying to drink out of a fire hose and serve as many of the exploited people that we can, and trying to just do the best that we can, despite the fact that there's a crushing problem in our country. And so after years of engaging in that type of work, I decided that I wanted to try to find some people that we could partner with and figure out a way to actually stop this problem. And so today is sort of a presentation on some of the things that we're doing to try to address that in our community, and I hope that they're relevant to your community. The driving force behind this is a quote from a survivor named Rachel Moran, who spoke here in Seattle a couple years ago. And she said during her speech, "How do you expect to uproot a tree when all you're doing is ripping at the leaves?" And what she was talking about there was the problem of the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and our response nationally, which has been often putting Band-Aids on the problem but really not getting at the root of the problem. And she wasn't talking so much to the general public, but she was talking to all of us who might intersect with this problem in the criminal justice system or otherwise, and asking us to think really carefully about what we've been doing and how we might adjust our approach to actually get around this problem. So I ask you to kind of keep that quote in mind as we go through this, because it really is at the center of everything that we're trying to do. When I look at the problem of commercial sexual exploitation, I see kind of three parties who are often involved: the prostituted person, who often represents the supply, the pimp, who represents the distribution, and the sex buyer, who represents the demand. And obviously there may or may not always be a pimp or a trafficker, but you're always going to see somebody in prostitution and somebody buying. And it's important to think about how all of these things intersect with each other rather than just thinking about them in isolation. I think over time, particularly in the criminal justice system, laws address one of these parties or another, but don't do a great job about thinking about how they intersect with each other and how, when we work on one side of this problem, that can have consequences to the other parts. So when we turn to the prostituted person and we kind of think about who those folks are and what we know about them, what we've learned in our work is that they are consistently among the most vulnerable in society. And I know this isn't going to be a surprise to anybody on this call, but vast numbers of them are sexually abused as children. Many enter as minors. We know that from our own data. We know it anecdotally. We know it from talking to survivors, and we know it from research. A large number of them have experienced poverty at crushing levels, and that includes past or current homelessness. And they are, at least in our community, disproportionately minorities. So, for example, in our community, in the commercial sexual exploitation cases that I've handled over the last 5 years, the minor victims in those cases, 52% of them were African American, while only 37% were white. And that's a kind of a shocking disproportionality when you look at it just in this chart. But when you compare it to our population, it is even more striking. African Americans in our county are only 7% of the population, yet they represent 52% of the minor victims. And so one of the kind of the watershed moments for me in thinking about this problem was talking to the director of a service provider agency in our area, and she said, when you're thinking about sort of what prostitution's all about, it's helpful to think about who ends up in prostitution and who's doing the buying. And when you look at this chart and you realize that who ends up in prostitution, again, are the most vulnerable, racial disproportionality is off the charts, that tells you a lot about what's going on, about who is getting funneled into this system. And I think it highlights the fact that sex buying is really a crime of power and privilege. And that's not something that we always are willing to address, but it's something that the data bears out quite strikingly. What we've also found, though, is not only are folks in prostitution vulnerable, but they experience tremendous violence. And, for a long time, I prosecuted a lot of pimps for several years, and I was under the impression, and I can understand that why, that much of the violence experienced by people in prostitution was from pimps and traffickers. And it's true, there is a lot of violence that occurs there, but actually there's been some research indicating that it's probably not as much as we think it is. And what in fact is going on out there is that there's a lot of violence from buyers. And these stats right here are from our website, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but from studies that we found that have talked about the incredible rate of violence inflicted by buyers against people in prostitution. And I think that cuts against this narrative that buyers are sort of these hapless buffoons who end up stumbling into, sexual transactions and high-fiving their buddies in Las Vegas. And it's actually quite the contrary, that there is an incredible prevalence of violence. Usually this is chalked up to this sort of belief that, buying comes with entitlement to do whatever you want, and that can end in physical assaults and rape and so forth. And so, you put the vulnerability together with the violence, and you have an incredibly toxic situation that really needs to be addressed. In our area, the exploitation of children is particularly high, although I'm sure that you all have this problem in your jurisdictions. We know from a study in our area that there's about 300 to 500 children in prostitution in King County. And just for those of you from across the country, King County is the 14th largest county in the country population-wise. We have about 2 million people. And we set up this collaborative to try to take in referrals for children at risk of sexual exploitation. And since April 2014, that collaborative has received 488 unique referrals for children who are at risk or currently being commercially sexually exploited, which is pretty consistent with the 300 to 500 estimate. Of the minors that I've seen in my cases in the last 5 years, 37% of them were under the age of 16, so they were between the age of 11 and 15, which really highlights, I think, the statistic earlier that so many of these kids get involved really, really early, and that makes it incredibly hard to get out. What's crazy about this, however, is that across the country, what has happened is that primarily for decades, the criminal justice response to this problem has been to arrest and prosecute women and children in prostitution. And this is data from our jurisdiction where we found that on the adult side at least, women in prostitution were being prosecuted at a rate of about 3 or 4 times what buyers were being prosecuted as. The arrest disproportionality was about 25 to 1, which is really disturbing for a number of reasons, but certainly not unique. I've seen the same distribution across other states in other parts of the country. And when we first collected this data back in 2012, I found it to be very disheartening. I think that it is morally and ethically questionable to be prosecuting and arresting the most vulnerable in our society who are the victims of tremendous violence. But I also want to point out that it doesn't work. For years, people have tried the approach of arresting and prosecuting women and children in prostitution, and it simply doesn't work. I have never heard of or read about or seen any circumstance anywhere in the country where somebody has gotten a grip on the problem of commercial sexual exploitation by arresting and prosecuting women and children. It does not work. And so the goal for us is to think about our current practices. What do we need to change, and where do we need to go to actually come up with an effective approach? Because as a prosecutor, there's nothing more frustrating than spinning your wheels in futility. And I'm sure that there's very few people out there who enjoy yelling into the wind all of their careers. So let's think about ways that we can actually try to make a positive difference. So one of the things we did initially was to really get focused on the traffickers and the pimps. And we prosecuted those guys very aggressively. We get sentences of 30 or 35 years on some of our traffickers, and everybody feels really good about that, and it's certainly demonstrating the high level of accountability that can be obtained. The problem is after prosecuting dozens and dozens of these guys, we started to kind of question the overall value. While these cases are incredibly valuable to the victims of those traffickers and absolutely necessary to follow through on, if your goal is to actually end the problem, I'm not sure that that's going to get you there. And that's kind of the conclusion that we came to. We need to prosecute these guys to hold these folks accountable. But at the same time, we need to think about ways that we can actually be a little bit more effective in how we do that. Pimps are not deterred by other pimps going to prison. They're enabled. And so how can we figure out a way that we're not really just sort of spinning our wheels forever? And so we started looking at the one area that nobody had really focused on as far as a concerted effort to address buyers. It's not to say that communities across the country hadn't done buyer stings. Of course, many communities had done that, but really focus on it as a comprehensive model to trying to respond to this issue. Who are these guys? I mean, that was the first kind of step that we needed to take in understanding them. And what we found is that they almost always had purchased more than once, and in fact, many times. Dozens. There were instances where we found buyers who had bought sex up to 1,000 times before. We also found that they came from all sectors of society, many different types of professions, although they, unlike the victims, were disproportionately white, middle, upper-class men. And here's the data that we have from our jurisdictions for men who were caught trying to buy sex from minors. 80% of them were white. And even in our very white area, if you look at them compared to the demographics of the county, they were disproportionately white at 80% compared to only 70% of the population in this area on the far left. So, it's a mirror image of the victimization side, which again, I think tells you a little bit about what the nature of prostitution is really all about. So why should we focus on that? On demand? Well, the first reason, I think quite clearly, is that buyers are directly and indirectly responsible for all of the harm experienced by prostituted people. What we mean by that is that they're directly responsible for harm by the violence that they inflict during the course of buying, rapes, assaults, homicides, and so forth. That's direct buyer violence against people in prostitution. And I think you can even take it a step further by quite clearly arguing that once you use money to change somebody's no into a yes, which is a great way of describing it, that was given to me by my friend Yasmin Wafa at Rights for Girls, when you take that money and you turn a no into a yes, you're engaged in a coercive act. And that right away can cause some serious problems as far as whether or not this is an act that is consenting. But the buyers are indirectly responsible for the harm experienced by prostituted people as well. And the reason for that is because they're creating the marketplace that incentivizes traffickers to actually engage in trafficking. Traffickers, contrary to popular belief, traffickers are not all simply sadists who enjoy whistling while they work. In fact, they are business people, first and foremost. And now there might be sadists and predators and so forth who are traffickers, but they are business people. And they are responding to a marketplace that incentivizes them to exploit the most vulnerable because those are the easiest so that they can make money. And so in that sense, the buyers are causing the marketplace for these traffickers. The second reason is, or the third rather, is the social justice component of this, which is namely that the most vulnerable, again, are the ones who bear the brunt of this industry at the expense, or rather, for the benefit of the people who are have the money, have the positions of privilege. And that's a concern, I think, anytime we're looking at the system that we want to develop around this issue. The third is quite simply the economics of it, and sometimes people get uncomfortable when I reduce, commercial sexual exploitation to an economic argument. But I'm not only saying it's economics, but we have to be mindful of the fact that this is a business. And some of the best approaches that I've seen around the country on this issue came from people who worked on economic crimes or on drugs and so forth, because they could understand supply and demand and how they relate to each other. But quite simply, if there's not going to be any buyers, there's not going to be any business. And so the incentive to traffic people is eliminated. And what we want to do is eliminate the business so that we are eliminating the exploitation. So to try to address this problem, we built a collaborative called the Ending Exploitation Collaborative between ourselves, the King County Prosecutor's Office, the City of Seattle City Attorney, an organization, a grassroots activist organization called Seattle Against Slavery, the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, and Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking. And these are all organizations or agencies within King County that work on different aspects of this. And we built a little collaborative, and together we started to craft a model that we are calling cleverly the Seattle-King County model. And that model has two primary prongs, which are dealing with the exploited persons and dealing with the exploiters. And on the exploited persons side, we want to reduce their involvement in the system, we want to offer them services, and we want to establish meaningful alternatives so that prostitution, for example, is not their only source of income. On the exploiter side, we want to prevent, we want to disrupt, intervene, and hold accountable exploiters. And we want to do all this built on a public, a constructive public awareness, a real understanding among the public about what the nature of the problem is, and sort of change the cultural norms that relate to this issue. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is on this right hand, the exploiter side, but I'm going to spend just 2 minutes talking about the exploited person side, because it's really important to understand how these things work together and are not in isolation. Sometimes people think that when we talk about focusing on the demand for commercial sex, we think that there is a perception that we want to take people's attention away from the victimization and the exploitation. That's definitely not the case. What we want to do is build those things as parallel systems that work together to try to end exploitation, because neither side on its own will accomplish that. So, for example, in our area, we've really tried to work on establishing a victim-centered approach, the justice component of that. And for children, the first step on that was to try to build a safe harbor inn, which I know many of you have. So our first charge of prostitution is a mandatory diversion, and the second is discretionary. And we took that a little bit further than the state law and actually just adopted an informal policy that we don't charge juveniles with prostitution in King County anymore. On the adult side, we've been building collaboratively between the city and the county diversion programs and resources for adults in prostitution. And the city of Seattle took a really interesting step by renaming patronizing or solicitation as sexual exploitation, because words matter, as we all know, and it sort of redefines what buying sex is really all about. On the services side, for children, we established CSEC advocates and a collaborative agencies with a collaborative of agencies with a 24-hour hotline, a foster care pilot, and then a larger model protocol that's being rolled out across the state. And for adults, an adult collaborative also with a 24-hour hotline. And I know that the focus of this is on the exploitation of minors, but what we have seen is how those kids who are being exploited obviously age up and they turn 18 and the exploitation doesn't end. And for other reasons that I'll talk about, we've also seen how the demand drives the exploitation of adults and children without really discriminating between those two. So between, building these services, reducing involvement, and establishing alternatives, we want to supplement that with a really robust response to the exploiter side. And the first thing that we wanted to do is kind of get to understand a little bit, what does the demand side actually really look like? Most of the country, including ourselves, really don't know a lot about demand, but what we started doing was trying to understand what it looks like and how big it is. And so the first thing that we did was go out on the internet and figure out where you could buy sex. And we found over 130 websites where you could buy sex in King County. And some of those sites are national, and that they have a site or a page for our area. Others are localized. But I would argue that there's not 100 of anything on the internet unless there's a big, big market for it. So that was kind of disturbing, not to mention the fact that when Backpage was really up and rolling about a year ago or a year and a half ago, it was posting 30 to 40,000 ads for prostitution a month. And again, you know, if Backpage is one of those 130 websites where you can buy sex, and they have that many ads per month, that gives you again a sense of the size of the marketplace. And that when I say that many ads per month, I mean just for our region, not nationally. In 2014, Arizona State University did a study here and found that in one 24-hour period on Backpage, there were 6,800, nearly 7,000 buyers actively soliciting sex in 24 hours. And they did that by posting fake ads and sort of measuring response rates and so forth. But the point is that that's a lot of people actively soliciting sex at any one time, just in our region, and I assure you that this is not an anomaly. This is consistent with all of the other numbers that we've seen from around the country. Review boards or review sites, also known as John boards, are places where people can go, buyers can go and talk about their prostitution experiences. In short, it's sort of Yelp for prostitution, where you can go and review and recommend and so forth. And we had a local review board here that on its own had 15 to 20,000 members. So there's review boards all over the country. But that means that you know, there was a lot of buyers on there who were members and who were actively monitoring or watching the information that was being posted and learning more about prostitution. And again, just a data point that tells us the market is big. When our detectives will post a fake prostitution ad on one of these sites, it's not unusual for them to get 200 or more responses in the first couple hours. And, you know, if you can think about your inbox at work sort of clicking away madly as floods of emails come in, it again gives you a sense of just how sort of vociferous the marketplace is for buying. And then in last summer, Seattle PD did an operation where they set up a fake massage parlor and had guys come in, and they arrested 204 men in 8 days at a single massage parlor, and there are about 75 of those in the city. Again, none of these data points tells you how big exactly the buying community is, but what it does tell you is that it's big, and that these are data points that sort of help us understand that. This is kind of what those numbers mean when we think about a strategic response to this issue. When on the left side there on supply, we have some data points and indicators that suggest to us that there's about 3,500 people in prostitution in King County, including adults and children, of which about 10% are children. And we have some other data points that tell us that probably the number of buyers is in excess of 20,000. It's probably more like 40, but let's say for argument's sake that it's 20,000. The problem is that you can rehabilitate, recover, rescue, however you want to describe it, people in prostitution all day long, every day, on the left side here. You can go after those folks all day, offer them services, do whatever you can, help them. But if you don't address this giant bar on the right, this financial juggernaut, then you're going to be recovering and rescuing until the end of time. And that was sort of put in perspective to us how this marketplace works, and how what we really need to do is do both. We need to help and offer services, and we also need to address this giant green bar. But here's where it gets a little bit more depressing, is that at our best, when we're all in, all our police agencies in our county are going after it, we can arrest maybe 200 to 300 to 400 people, which is this little red bar at the bottom. 200 to 300, 400 buyers a year, which immediately highlights the problem of taking an approach to this issue that is only criminal justice based. Quite simply, we cannot arrest our way out of this problem. The scope of the marketplace vastly exceeds the ability of the criminal justice system to respond to on its own. And if we don't start from that place, that premise and understanding how little capacity our police have to address this problem and how big the problem is and how it directly drives the exploitation, then we will adopt a strategy that is completely misguided. And so we started from this basic point. And as a side note, by the way, when people start talking about decriminalization and legalization and so forth, what I would argue quite clearly, and I think this has been borne out in basically every place that has ever tried it, what do you think is going to happen to that big green bar on the right side when you decriminalize? It's going to go through the roof. And what happens then is the financial juggernaut just becomes bigger and drives more exploitation. And in fact, that's exactly what we've seen happen in Holland and Germany and other places. So this is, I think, helpful to kind of think about when we're thinking about strategies. So maybe you're listening to this and you think I'm crazy and, this whole, economic argument is off base. Well, I offer to you this posting by a buyer from a review board. His name was, cleverly Decanter. He's a hobbyist, and for those of you new to this, a hobbyist is a buyer who really takes exquisite pride in being a buyer and a connoisseur, if you will, because they then call it a hobby. And he says, let's face it, the Seattle hobby scene is thriving due in no small part to the area's tech industry. Sure, it inflates prices a bit, but it also significantly increases the demand to a level that keeps existing providers busy and new ladies interested in checking it out. And then he goes on to complain about something that we were doing. What he's saying here is that the demand scene, the hobby scene, is currently exploding in our area due to the influx of tech workers. And so, apologies to those of you who might have connections to the tech industry, but the reality is that we're seeing a pretty significant increase that can be pretty closely tied to the tech industry, that there's just a lot of men with money and, internet savvy, and there's buyers. And so he's complaining here about the fact that the buying, that these new buyers are increasing prices. There's so many of them that they're actually shifting market prices upwards, which is annoying for Decanter. However, he also acknowledges that the fact that the demand has gone up so much keeps women in prostitution and, quote, new ladies interested in checking it out. Well, what do you think that is? That is foreign nationals being piped in through Los Angeles into brothels in our area. That's juveniles being recruited in malls and so forth. That is the new ladies interested in checking it out. And what I think is really important here is that when the buyers are talking about how supply and demand works on this, we need to pay attention because they understand it. Why don't we understand it, and why aren't we doing anything about it, I think is the real question. So what all of this tells us is that, sex buying is an individual behavior problem. We understand it as on a transaction by transaction basis, it's a problem. But really, it's also a social problem. And it is a large social problem that we need a response to. And so what we did is we took this thought about it being a social problem and we created this. And this is the targeted sectors of society that we decided we really needed to focus on. And I'm going to talk about each of these for a couple minutes. The most I'm going to cover is probably going to be in some of the technology and the criminal justice sectors. But I think one of the things that you can notice right out of the gate on this is that criminal justice is but one slice of this pie. And so I know there's a lot of folks on the call who are not just in the criminal justice system, and this is really built for the entire community. This model is built for our entire region to be able to respond to this issue, to really increase and supplement our capacity for the criminal justice system, not to expect our police to do it on their own. So let's talk about each of these real quickly. So the criminal justice sector is, while it's not a sufficient partner, it is absolutely a necessary partner. If we don't have the criminal justice system on board, then it's really hard to demonstrate to the community that buying is a serious problem. And so what we did here, and this is a chart that shows kind of how we have shifted our approach. The blue represents prostituted minors, so these are minors charged with prostitution in our county. I'm not super proud of that data. I will point out in my own defense that the 2009-10 numbers were before my time. But anyway, back in 2009, we charged over 50 kids with prostitution and only 2 buyers. And I would say that that is a profoundly misguided approach. But over time, what we did is we got kids out of the criminal justice system. In the last 2 years, no minors have been charged at all, and that's our current approach. But you can see in 2013, we really decided that we had to start going aggressively after men trying to buy sex from minors. And now we're averaging about 40 to 45 of those charges a year. Those are serious felony offenses. And that's 175 men who were willing to pay a minor for sex. Most of them knowing that the age of the minor was 15 because we were doing stings. And those are 175 men that have been prosecuted in a very serious way now for that, which I think is really important to demonstrate to the community that's totally unacceptable. We've also been working on trying to do this on the adult side, and you can see that we reached a peak in 2010 in King County and the municipalities that make up King County, about 450 charges of prostitution, and last year we had 37, so 8% of what it used to be, which I'd like to see that number go down to 0 and get all those folks into services. But that precipitous drop is not because people aren't in prostitution anymore. It means that we are addressing it in a very different way and getting them into services. Because that drop is so big, the yellow doesn't look like a very large climb, but we went from, we've had about a 35% increase over the last 4 years in the number of buyers that we've gone after, and we'd like to see that continue to go up and really flip the script from what it used to be. Part of this is really about demonstrating a credible risk for buyers, particularly buyers of children. If we go back to this slide, it's really about demonstrating that this is not okay and that you can get caught, and when you get caught, there are serious consequences. The second thing it's about is demonstrating to the community that we don't think that buying is a victimless crime, that we think it causes a tremendous harm, and that we really want to focus on those guys who are causing the harm. And so these charts get shown a lot by the media. They talk about it. They spread the information. The buyers talk about it online, how certain cities are really aggressive about buyers. It's a discussed topic, and that is a big shift from where we were 5 years ago. What we also have done is thought very clearly about how to sort of make this part of the model connect to the part I talked about earlier, which is the exploited person. And so, for example, on the guys who are trying to buy sex from minors, there's a $5,000 fee that's assessed on those individuals who are arrested for that. And 50% of that goes to victim services, 48% to fight the commercial sex industry, and 2% to our State Department of Commerce. And the reason that's so significant is what that 50% is now going to fund the services of the people who were harmed by those buyers. And it really becomes sort of a circular system, a self-sustaining system, where the men who are causing the harm are funding the rehabilitation. And that fee is set up in state statute, and that distribution is in state statute. But for years, nobody was really paying attention to it. Nobody was imposing it or collecting it or even arresting and charging these guys. And what we realized is we could do that, and actually it could help services rather than to take money away from them. And so over the last 4 years, we've collected over $330,000 just from those 175 guys that I mentioned earlier, which I think is a significant boost to those services and to law enforcement to work on this issue. One of the problems, though, that we learned is that the Internet, and again, this is not a surprise to anybody, the Internet is a giant facilitator of this crime, and in fact has made the commercial sex industry ridiculously efficient. Buying sex from somebody online, we all could have somebody purchase by the end of this webinar, and it's not really much more difficult than buying something on Amazon. And so the question becomes, how do you, at a broader scale, sort of gum up this marketplace and really start to try to put friction in the marketplace? And that's the kind of the way I think about this issue is, we're not going to stop it overnight, but we can start to put friction in it so it's not so dang efficient over time. And so what we did, if you think about, there's kind of three ways that demand meets supply on the internet. One is through review boards, which I talked about earlier. The other is through search engines, and the other is through posting websites like Backpage.com. Search engines would be like Google, and review boards would be like John Board, like I talked about. So the first thing I wanted to kind of address here is review boards. And review boards, one in our area looked like this. It's just kind of a page of lots of different conversations. And you can see at the bottom, it's a little hard to read, but it says K-Girl recommendation. And K-Girl is a Korean person in prostitution. And these guys will just say, hey, I'm looking for a K-Girl recommendation. And then everybody will respond with their favorites and tell them how to get in touch with them and so forth. It's an incredible networking device around prostitution. And the thing that makes it so toxic is that, Backpage is obviously incredibly problematic, but on Backpage, everybody's a competitor. People are not colluding. But on a review board, everybody's in it together. They are always colluding. They are always talking. They're always trying to share information and to build more efficient marketplaces. And that's what is really problematic and makes the system even more efficient. The review board in our area was, again, sort of obviously called the review board. And it had, this is sort of the organizational structure of it, but it was owner, operators, and moderators and elite posters sort of comprised the top of the pyramid, while general members and occasional posters comprised the middle part. And that was the 15 to 20,000 members that I mentioned earlier. And then there's non-member viewers, because it was open to the public. Anybody could go on and read the information. What happened is that then the sort of elite posters created their own special little review campfire circle called the League, where they had about 50 to 70 members nationally. So they had these groups of men from all over the country who would join this league. They had their own website that was password protected. And then they got really inspired and they started networking together a little bit more and trying to think about how to make the market even better for themselves. And so they built this website called kgirldelights.com, which was essentially a back page for Korean prostitution. And it got big enough and popular enough that in December of 2015 it was getting 14 million hits a month. It was for the West Coast. The reason that I bring all of this up is that, again, I think that there has long been this narrative nationally that buyers are individuals who engage in sexual transactions that are just money for sex, and that's it. There's no networking, there's no collusion, there's no mutual peer-to-peer support. And in fact, what we're learning is that it is far more organized and networked than we ever thought was the case. And this particular case that we had is a really great example where these guys were really evolving from merely being buyers on a website like Backpage to actually engaging in fairly comprehensive pimping or cyber pimping activities, building websites for people in prostitution. Some of them had their names on leases for brothels. Some of them were, helping read and write ads and so forth. They just got really involved. What we have seen is that there are a number of review boards around the country. We found minors discussed on many of them. We found pictures and ads of minors discussed on them. It is an incredibly toxic problem, and it is much more comprehensive and organized than we thought, as I've already mentioned. And I bring that up because I think a real opportunity for law enforcement in the coming years will be to try to address these networked buyers around the country and to disrupt these marketplaces that are actively contributing to the exploitation of others. In our case, we actually seized the review board and prosecuted 30 of the 29 of the most prolific buyers off of it. And we prosecuted them for promoting prostitution, which is essentially pimping, because of their work to try to promote the industry, not just for their individual transactions. So we argued that by putting content on this website, they were promoting the prostitution of particular people at particular agencies. And I think that there are, again, numerous opportunities to try to engage this, and that's the reason I bring it up for people around the country to think about ways that we can disrupt these networked buyers. Government and social services. So beyond the criminal justice system, there's a lot of opportunity for different government agencies to get involved, and here are a couple examples of what I'm talking about. So, governments can and communities can adopt laws and policies and practices that really help support robust exit services for the exploited, but also promote accountability to end sex buying. Again, the two prongs of our model. And they can support the community education and public awareness around that to actually end sex buying. So an example would be that we developed a proclamation in concert with Seattle Against Slavery, and they went around to all of these communities in our county and got them to adopt a proclamation that condemned sex buying and that actively committed their city to trying to address the problem. It doesn't require a lot of resources to do a proclamation, in fact, virtually zero. However, it is a very important public statement about where your community comes down on this, and that is a step in trying to change the culture that enables this activity. Another social service that has been really fundamental to our approach is the development of a class called the Stopping Sexual Exploitation program for men. This is an overhaul of the traditional John School. Most of the programs around the country are, anywhere from maybe a short video to a 6-hour lecture. This is a 10-week program, once a week for 10 weeks. And it's a program that was developed by a guy named Peter Qualiotine out of Organization for Prostitution Survivors. He had developed one of the first John Schools in the country in Portland about 25 years ago and had always envisioned a much more comprehensive and extensive program. And he launched this about 2 years ago, and we run it in concert with our efforts to hold buyers accountable. And so what we do is we order them to the class as a condition of their sentence, not as a diversion. We have moved away from diversions entirely for buyers because we don't feel that it reflects the serious nature of the crime, and instead seems to be kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of approach, like, oh, let's go do this class, this 6-hour class, and you won't have anything on your record. Well, that's not okay. We need to have a conviction on the record, but then they also need to go to the class, and the purpose of the class is to try to reduce recidivism. And so the class, you can learn more about it on the OPS website, which I can give out if folks are interested. But the class really tries to get at the root of what the problem is. Many of the John School classes around the country are oriented around trying to tell men about the harm, and the reality is they don't care about the harm, and they already know about it. What this class does is try to address the sort of issues that lie at the root of the problem for these guys, which is socialization around sex buying, and a number of other associated issues, and try to deconstruct that and really unpack it. And I'm not going to get into depth about the curriculum right now, other than to say to talk a little bit about how there are 2 motivational interviewing classes and then 8 group sessions. And the individual motivational interviewing is really taken from some techniques that have worked well in other areas like chemical dependency before the men go into a group setting. Because if they start out in a group setting, they're usually bond together in a hostile way and are not really opening themselves up to conversations. And for any of you who've done John Schools and watch how they all sit with their arms crossed at the beginning, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And then these 8 classes address all of these various topics and trying to kind of understand how these guys got to where they are. Because one of the things that we've learned in working with a lot of these buyers is that most of them are pretty screwed up. They are not healthy men mentally or otherwise. And I know this because on those 175 guys I've prosecuted for trying to buy sex from minors, we get a sexual deviancy evaluation, which is an extensive evaluation of whether or not they are a deviant. And a couple interesting things have come out of that. One is that the number who are deviant is about 5%, even though all of them have been caught for trying to buy sex from children. And what that highlighted for us was the fact that men who buy sex from teenagers are typically not deviant and not predators in the way that we often want to think about them. On the contrary, it's not that they were trying to buy kids, it's that they were trying to buy anyone and the kid was available. And that is kind of a real shift in how we've approached this problem. Now I want to highlight that this is a different group of guys from guys who are involved in the ICAC cases. For example, internet crimes against children, so we're talking about guys who are interested in buying like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. Very, very different group from that. These are guys who went online interested in buying somebody who was 18 to 20. A 15-year-old was presented to him and he went ahead and did it. That's the kind of guys that we're talking about. And these guys need some sex offender treatment, but they also need this treatment to understand kind of the general problem of buying. What's been great is that the attitude surveys of these guys coming out of the program have been really positive. They have they at a high rates agree that they don't want to be doing this, that it had negative impacts on their life, that they want to talk to other men about not doing it. These are all really positive things. And so we're trying to measure this program to determine effectiveness. And then at some point, obviously, we need to do a recidivism study once there's been sufficient time. And by recidivism, I mean a recidivism as to actually talking with them about whether they bought, not a recidivism study about whether they got rearrested, because most of these guys do not. So let's talk a little bit about technology. This is probably the area that has involved the most evolution in our approach. And that, again, circles back to this issue about the demand and the supply meeting on the internet. And so I've already talked a little bit about review boards, but I want to talk a little bit about search engines now and other related topics. So the first thing is sort of understanding our buyers online, and the answer is absolutely. Again, this shouldn't be a surprise for anybody. I see a question there, can someone define deviant? So what I mean is clinically sexually deviant, which would be an actual diagnosis as opposed to just being like a person we disagree with morally and ethically. And I'll defer to sort of, you know, the sex offender treatment providers to take it further than that, but I mean it as a clinical diagnosis. So we know that buyers are online, and we know this because we can see that they search for sex through Google and Bing and all the other search engines. And when you go online and you type in, say, for example, escort reviews tonight, 4.8 million results come up. In our area, I'm sure it's the same in other areas. If you type, there's all sorts of terms that you can type in to get to that point. So what we thought is that, you know, when you go on to Google and you type in lawnmower and the first 3 or 4 results are ads for lawnmowers at Lowe's or Sears, what if, like, the first thing these guys saw was not the adult entertainment guide or Roshana's escort service, but what if they saw an ad that was like, you know, don't do this? And so we figured out how to do that. There's a thing called a search ad, which Google allows you to pay for, or if you're a nonprofit, they give you the ad space for free. And this is an example of that. So it says, want to buy sex, cops are arresting buyers, and if she's underage, she'll be a sex offender. And that's the, the ad that they see first, right above, ironically, the TNA board, which is one of the most toxic, horrific review boards in our area, a review board where I've personally found juveniles located. So, you know, this is the thing that they can see instead of the first thing being, here's where you go to buy sex. And what we did is we created, so when they click on that, they're brought to a website. And here's another example of one from Google, police are arresting buyers, you could become a sex offender. When you click on that, you're brought to a very basic website that we created, which has some information about the harm of prostitution. It has information about the consequences. And then it also has information about alternatives, where you can go and you can click on this and you're brought to the site for the class. And interestingly, the #1 page on this website is this one, the alternatives. And what we learned is that there are a lot of buyers out there, in fact, the vast majority, who are not happy with what they're doing. There was a survey of 1,000 people done last year, and 76% of the buyers said they wanted to stop. Again, this really conflicts with sort of the national narrative about buying and what's going on, and in fact highlights that many of the guys that we see are depressed, have chemical dependency problems, have anger problems, have relationship problems, you know, various issues in their life that they then think that buying is the outlet that will fix all those things, and they know it doesn't, and so they go to this page because they are looking for something else. So what's interesting about this is we started running this, and I mentioned before that we could arrest maybe 300-400 guys a year. Right now we're averaging 100,000 impressions or appearances of our ads a month on Google, just in King County. So 100,000 a month versus 300 arrests a year. This completely opened our eyes to the possibilities that you can have a criminal justice response, but you can supplement it with other forms of engagement. We have about a 2% click-through rate to the website, which means that's 2% of those, so about 2,000 clicks to the website per month, which is directing people then to the class. And since we've started running this, the hits to the website for the class have gone through the roof comparatively to what they were before. Interestingly, the most common time for click-through rate was in the data that we had was 2 p.m. And I'm going to come back to that number in a few minutes, but just chew on that for a second. Think about what people are doing at 2 p.m. So since we started this campaign, over 2 million impressions just in our area again, which I think is a testament to the vast reach of this type of tactic. The next thing, then, we kind of took it a step further, and a lot of this work has been done by Seattle Against Slavery, whose director is a former tech employee and has some great skills to bring to this issue. And what we learned is, not only are they online, not only are they buyers on search engines, but they're also on social media. And the way that was determined was by taking a bunch of phone numbers from sex buying investigations. They collected all of them and they pumped them into Facebook, and they found that about a quarter of them were connected to Facebook profiles. And this creates you can create a lookalike profile for about, for Facebook users in your area. They did it initially for about 2 million Facebook users nationwide. And it takes a whole ton of various characteristics, like age, income level, et cetera, and they don't tell you what all those are, but they do tell you, would you like to advertise to them? And it can create an incredibly accurate marketing audience for your jurisdiction. And so we did that, and we, being Seattle Against Slavery and our collaborative, we did that and started developing ways to advertise directly to those guys. So this was an early example of one of the ads. We were fiddling around with memes, which we, turned out to be highly effective because it gets people's attention and they click on them. But then over time, we developed some very short videos, and those were about 15 seconds each. And this is a screenshot from one of them, where we interviewed a bunch of the buyers from the class, and we talked to them, what would you have told you before you got arrested if you were trying to discourage yourself from doing this? We wanted it to come from the buyers, because those are the guys who really know what it's all about, what the feelings are about that are going on. And so people were saying things like, I couldn't go to my kid's birthday party because I'm a registered sex offender. I used to be my daughter's favorite, now she won't even look at me. And this is, from a guy I actually prosecuted who said when he told his daughter she went in the bathroom and threw up. And, that wreckage that he caused to his family was the thing that really got him around. It wasn't that he was causing harm to a minor. He realizes that now, but at the time they really don't want to think about it. And so these videos are then shown in, we advertise these videos to those lookalike profiles on Facebook, and they show up in their feed, and they can click on them, and they're once again brought to the website. The interesting thing about that is that, again, talking about volume, so right now these videos are, the impressions of these are about 195,000 impressions a month, just in King County. And so, again, you compare that to the arrest rates and the arrest volumes, it's highly, highly accurate and highly broad reach, which is really what we want out of this. From our perspective, though, this doesn't work if the police aren't doing arrests, because the guys know if arrests are happening, and we've seen communities that have tried doing this advertising without also having arrests, and the buyers were mocking it. They were saying, no, nobody's out there arresting buyers. It's not, of course we know that that's not the case, so who cares? But in communities where arrests are happening, there's quite a lot of panic, which is really what you're hoping to do. Another example, just relatedly on how we are trying to build a comprehensive model both on the exploited side and on the exploiter side, is that some volunteers in the tech industry have helped develop another tool which can do automatic text to numbers on Backpage offering help. And so it can scrape the phone numbers of people in prostitution and automatically text them and offer them help. And if the person responds, it's redirected to a live advocate. And this is an example of ways that we can actually use technology in a positive way rather than constantly losing the battle to technology, which is what's been happening for the last decade. And I can go into that tool later more if people want to learn more about it. Education. So in addition to playing the short game of arrests of buyers, we're playing the long game in terms of prevention. And so again, Seattle Against Slavery has developed a curriculum that's based off of a curriculum from Case Northwestern. It's called Trafficking Prevention for Schools. And they have educated over 1,000 students in local high schools. And this programming is again, a little bit maybe different than past curricula. It does not say, hey, girls, don't get trafficked, which is some curricula we've seen. It's more about, hey, girls and boys, here's what healthy relationships look like. Here's how we engage in a respectful way, in a mutual way with others around us, and tries to kind of counter the socialization of men for sex buying. And so far, seems to be incredibly well received by the students and is increasingly prevalent throughout the schools in our community. Employers. So one of the things that we learned is that many of the buyers are employed by reputable organizations. We collected some data early on from the guys that we were prosecuting, and we found that these were the industries that they were coming from. And what that tells you is they come from every industry, right? There's no particular concentration, although there are sectors of the society that are overrepresented. For example, IT is 12% of the buyers, but only 6% of the workforce, so that tells you a little something. But what it told us, in addition to where buyers were coming from, was that we needed to engage those employers in a way that could be both non-conflict or non-adversarial way of engaging them, but also try to get them to engage with their employees to reduce this, because it could increase our capacity. And just a quick note, where it says government at the bottom, that's entirely military. So I think with one exception. So I don't want to imply that a bunch of us from the public sector are engaged in this. I'm sure some are, but it seems like that is primarily a military issue. So what we concluded was that employers can change buyer behaviors. They have a very significant leverage point over buyers, even more so maybe than the kind of long shot risk of getting arrested. And this brings us back to that 2 p.m. number that I mentioned earlier, that if guys are online trying to set up dates and searching for sex at 2 p.m., it means they're doing it at work. And it possibly means they're doing it with company resources, but they're most certainly doing it on company time. And the reason they're doing it at 2 p.m. is because they're setting up their date for after work for on the way home. And we've talked to a bunch of survivors who have 2/3 of the survivors that we interviewed had met clients on company property. And that's a significant liability PR risk for any business, not to mention a productivity issue. And when we started talking with businesses about this data, they freaked out, understandably, and we got their ear. And so I think that they are now sort of attuned to the problems that this can create for them. And so one of our partner organizations, Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking, has built this thing called the Employers Alliance, which is a group of employers who are dedicated to trying to review their approach to this issue, their own policies, and to figure out ways that they can do better. And that realizing that they can impact their own employees' behavior, but they can also then interrupt sexual exploitation by ensuring that their services are not being used or misused, rather, by traffickers. So, for example, hotels or transportation industry or whatever it is, that they can try to prevent their products from being misused by these traffickers. And so they created this as the sort of first public-private partnership, and it requires an online self-assessment, and then they get sample policies, they can get examples, they get online training, and all of this is open to businesses. And again, I want to return to that chart that I showed you before, which is the giant scope of demand and the tiny scope of what the criminal justice system can address, and say that this is then really crucially supplemental to that, and allows people to really build on top of it. I'm noticing the time, so I'm going to kind of cruise through these last two and so that we can have some time for questions. The health sector is one of the most important sectors in all of this, because through the health sector we can really start to understand sex buying as a problem of gender-based violence, and the prevalence of it. 15 to 20% of adult men engaged in it means that it's a pretty significant public health problem. And again, by engaging buyers through the health sector, we can redefine our approach as being one of violence prevention. That by getting men to stop buying sex, we are preventing violence. And that is probably the most significant change that we can get at. We can also understand that attitudes can be changed, that there's not a biological imperative, and the reason we know that is because how we've seen attitudes changed in other areas of the sex buying through the class, and also because we know that 85% of men don't buy sex. So that sort of cuts against the biological imperative notion. So what we are advocating for with the health sector, and we started engaging STD clinics and the healthcare professionals on this issue, is moving away from a harm reduction focus to a violence prevention focus, and therefore, incorporating a gender-based violence approach into our anti-trafficking prevention curricula. For example, the SOAR training put out by HHS. If this training can also incorporate then a buying component where it really can try to prevent violence by getting guys to buy less sex, that would be an ideal scenario. Or sexual assault prevention curricula on campus, that they can incorporate that curricula into the sexual assault prevention programming, so that it's not just, hey, young men, don't rape. also don't buy sex, because what we're finding is that tends to be a pretty significant area for non-consensual sex. What we have found is that we can reach buyers, again, at a very high rate through the health system. So, for example, we're doing a pilot project right now where we're putting pamphlets for the class in the STD clinics, because buyers go to STD clinics instead of their family doctor because they don't want their family doctor to know or their family to know. So they go to the STD clinics, and that's a great time to get them because they're vulnerable. They're feeling like they may have just given their wife, an STD, or they're feeling like they made really stupid decisions, and that's a great time to talk with them about stopping. And so we have started to try some pilot projects that engage the health sector in focusing not only on victimization, but also on the buyers themselves, and then trying to encourage them to make a referral. If 76% of buyers want to stop but are having trouble doing so, then we need to get them to a resource that can help them with that. Public awareness is the last piece of this pie, and that's really important because the whole system is kind of founded on changing cultural norms around this. So we work at getting coverage in the media, but we also try to provide resources, and you can go to this website, endingexploitation.com, which is the website for our collaborative. And it just has some basic information about some of the stuff we're doing, but also about services. And I think there's some good information, and it can show kind of how we have built a comprehensive approach to this problem. And it also has access to the website for the class as well. The impact of this, we've charged a lot of guys with trying to buy sex from minors, in addition to a lot of guys buying sex from adults. We've raised money for victim services through fines, dismantled the websites that have been particularly problematic and really contributing to the problem, getting these guys into a new 10-week program, engaging over 30 employees with over 30 employers with over 200,000 employees, and training staff in 170 hotels, reaching over 1,000 high school students. 2 million impressions of the buyer beware ads, which is what we call the ads that run with the messaging online that I showed you earlier. And one of the interesting things is that during the year before Backpage shut down, the most common term on Google to reach commercial sex websites was Backpage escorts. And over the year prior to the shutdown that we were running the ads, we saw a 29% reduction in those searches for that with that term. Again, an indicator. It's not a proof of success, but it's an indicator that we can impact sort of how people are using the internet in a negative way to engage in commercial sexual exploitation. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you so much, Val. We have over at least 50 to 60 questions that have been put in by some of our over 500 participants, and I've kind of grouped them into enforcement, dynamics, and PIMP questions. One of the big conversations on the chat box was the school justice partnership. Some people have said that in their area they have trouble getting the district to allow trafficking awareness programs into schools at all. How do you address the kind of barriers that you were getting into to be able to get into schools, and are there any trafficking prevention programs that you know of that are extremely effective for schools to use?
Well, two responses to that. One is that I think the best thing would probably be to connect you with Seattle Against Slavery that runs the curricula, and I can certainly do that. I can send Kelly or Adam contact websites or emails, or you can find their website off of our website, the group website, endingexploitation.com. The second thing, though, that more to the question specifically, is that I think one of the problems can be approaching it as trafficking. If you come into schools talking about wanting to train, kids not to be trafficked, or people can kind of freak out a little bit because it's so hard to get into schools to even talk about sex. And so one of the ways that they've worked it is talking more about just relationships and how building respect among the student population and talking about it more like that. And that tends to be a slightly more palatable entry point. And so I might think about redefining the issue a little bit away from trafficking and more towards how can we build a healthy student population and engage in violence prevention.
Thank you. All right, so another question we have is related to the sort of the child welfare crossover. And Mr. Ritchie, if you could address, are there any separate efforts being made to hold parents who are trafficking their children or parents who are not paying enough attention while their children are being victimized? Is there any efforts being paid to hold those parents accountable?
Well, if they're trafficking them, then most certainly they can be charged with a crime. And so, you know, we have seen cases of familial trafficking, and that can often take the place of moms who are sort of tacitly supporting the exploitation of their daughters. Maybe not they're the one, they might not be the one actually turning them out, but they might be the one who's maintaining a relationship with a trafficker, and I've seen cases like that. I think if you're talking just about negligence, sort of negligent parenting, which then leads to homelessness, which then leads to exploitation, that's a little bit more of a challenging approach, challenging case to make. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I haven't seen that done very effectively, where it's purely negligence or abandonment kind of issues.
So one of the other questions we had, Mr. Ritchie, related to boys being trafficked. And earlier in the chat box, there was a question that said, when you refer to women and children being prosecuted, how many of the children that are victimized are actually male or transgender identifying?
Yeah, great question. So of the 75 that I sort of mentioned in the last 5 years, only 5 were boys. You know, I've seen a couple studies that have talked about it being 50-50, boys and girls being exploited. I have some questions about some of those studies because I think some of them, for example, went to LGBTQ shelters to interview people, so it's sort of self-selecting. However, I don't want to at all undermine the clear point that boys are most certainly included. We've done some stings for, you know, posing as juvenile boys, and they've been effective, although at a much lower rate than the ones posing as girls. It is most certainly a marketplace, but it is a slightly more, it's just not quite the same in the sense that there aren't vast warehouses, vast marketplaces online for them, or at least not in the same way. We have identified some websites where boys are posted, but it's a tricky issue as far as trying to kind of figure out how to break into that community. That being said, the exploitation of boys most certainly is a problem, and is something that we are trying to figure out how to address. And so far, that's been through some a fairly modest number of stings.
Mr. Ritchie, we also had a question that just came in from Terry Friend. In your work, did you learn any lessons specific to Native American youth? And we know that tribal communities and tribal populations have extraordinarily high rates of trafficking victimization. Any lessons specific to Native American youth in your work?
Well, I mean, I think in my experience that the exploitation of Native American youth really fits the pattern that we see in every other area, which is that vulnerability begets exploitation. And so, you know, we know that rates of chemical dependency and poverty and homelessness and prior trauma and all of those things are just as prevalent among Native children as they are among non-Native children. So, I mean, I think that it's quite clear that that population is just as likely to be exploited. I think one of the things that I have learned in the cases that I've handled involving tribal areas is the real need to be present in those investigations, to be communicating directly with people involved there in a slightly different way than I might normally. And so I try to visit the locations of the investigation, spend a little bit more time with the community members explaining sort of what's going on and making sure that we have understanding on all parties. I've tried to just do it a little bit more conscientiously than maybe in other cases. And then the last avenue I'll mention on this is that we know that there's a lot of commercial sexual exploitation occurring in casinos, and in Washington we have quite a few casinos on tribal areas, and we need to do a better job, I think, about building partnerships with the management, the tribal management of those casinos, and try to figure out a way that we can all work together to address that particular issue. That has not been an area where we've made a lot of progress so far.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. And for those of us who are still on the line, I want to let you know that if we don't get to your question in this webinar, it will be answered, and it will be answered in writing and posted in the archive when we also post this webinar. We also have a dynamics question from Sylvia Jackson. And as you know, on the chat box, there was actually a robust conversation on the notion of a sexualized society and hypersexualization, as well as the pornography industry. And Sylvia mentioned that we live in a sexualized society. How do we address this kind of overwhelming challenge of hypersexualization when we perform trafficking response? How do you address that in your work, and how should some of the participants, all of whom work in trafficking industries, how do we address that?
Whew. Yeah, it's a great question, Sylvia. I wish I had an answer that fixed the whole problem. What I will say is that your point is has borne out in the evidence that I've seen in all those evaluations that we're getting from men who are buying sex from kids. They almost invariably have a serious pornography problem and refer to it as an addiction, although we're careful about using the words, sex addiction, because we don't want to remove accountability from these guys, and we think accountability is really important. But we see pornography a lot in this issue. We see it on the victimization side, and then it's really been expanding through the sugar baby, sugar daddy websites as well. So the way that we sort of think about that is one way is through this class, the 10 weeks where these guys spend some time thinking kind of about sexuality and socialization and how it relates to their mental health, their mental development. So for example, what we're finding over and over and over again is that these guys will be depressed, and they have been taught that going out and having sex will fix that problem. And so they feel good at the time of the sex, but then they feel guilty and ashamed, so they go out and do it again, and then they feel guilty and ashamed, so they go out and do it again. And it just becomes this sort of perpetual cycle. And what we're trying to do is sort of one guy at a time break that cycle a little bit and help to understand that you're never going to get to health through this avenue. And some people get a little uncomfortable because it sounds like I am advocating for empathy for the white guy buying from exploited people. And what I think what I think I would say in response to that is that I'm interested in preventing harm to exploited people, and if that requires me to go meet the buyer where they are mentally, then I will do that. And so what we need to do is maybe, we found that sort of judgment and shaming have been pretty unproductive in this avenue. It tends to isolate people and make them increasingly hostile, and a better way might be to try to invite them to think about a different way of being, and that's been much more effective through the class. As far as it being a societal problem, I think if we can redefine sex buying as a form of gender-based violence and incorporate it in with all of those other areas where we've made a lot of progress, like sexual harassment, domestic violence, and rape, then I think we can understand it as being on the spectrum of the same type of conduct and all part of the same problem that we're trying to address. I think that would be a very effective way to proceed.
Thank you. And following up on that question, we also had a question from Iona Rudisil regarding meeting the buyers where they are. And she mentioned what follow-up is done to actually see how former buyers are responding? Are there any studies, or is there a tool that's used? And if you do use the tool, is it validated or accurate?
Yeah, so the program has only been running 2 years, so we haven't been able to do a study on it yet. What is being done through the program is they do these attitude surveys at the end of the class to make sure they have a record of where people are, and also to try to measure where are they coming out of this class. The plan then is that we will do a recidivism study out a little ways where we can look at what guys did after the fact, and that way have a valid measurement of its effectiveness. What I will say is that anecdotally, my experience with the buyers coming out of the class has been really phenomenal. I've worked with sex offenders. I worked in sexual assault as a prosecutor for years before this, and I worked with many, many sex offenders, sending them to sex offender treatment. Never once in all of those cases did I ever have a guy come back and say, thank you for that class or that treatment, that was really helpful, or have their attorney say that. Since this program has been running, that happens all the time. Through their attorneys or directly to us or to the guy who teaches it, these guys have just been so thankful for the class. And so speaking of it so highly, it's really kind of shocking, actually. But what it's highlighting for me, at least, is that many of them were in a bad place, and they were looking for some kind of resource. And when that was offered to them, it was pretty meaningful. I had guys say, like in court, tell me, thank you, that was really fantastic that I went there, because they went there before their sentencing. I've just never seen that before. So I'm pretty optimistic about it, and we have enough to go forward without waiting for a study. So thank you.
So Mr. Ritchie, just following up on that question, you've had such wonderful, wonderful responses from targeting buyers. One of the questions we had early on was, does prosecuting a buyer equal justice, big justice with a big J, for the victim? And what sort of response have you had from victims and survivors from your program prosecuting buyers, and do they want buyers to be prosecuted?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was actually, that interaction was one of the things that got us to focus on buyers. We were having a hard time with juveniles who were not willing to report on their traffickers. They weren't at a place where they wanted to do that. They were maybe still in love with them. And so the detectives started trying this different tactic where they would say, okay, well, if you don't want to talk about that, we can come back to that. But are there any guys that have paid that you don't like? And it turns out that the people in prostitution tend to hate their buyers. They are the ones raping them, right? They're the ones who are paying and having sex with them, whereas the trafficker often presents themselves as a boyfriend, or even if they beat them, it's sort of a domestic violence relationship where they love the person and so forth. But buyers, they really don't like buyers, and they might pretend that they do, but it's called a trick for a reason, right? And we have found that actually a lot of people in prostitution dislike greatly their buyers. They hate them, and they want to report on ones who are violent. They want to come forward, and we've gotten a lot of support for that. It doesn't mean, though, necessarily that they are excited about going to testify about it, but usually we can get them there if we work with them enough and build a rapport. But my experience has been that they've been quite supportive of that. And that has led us to be able to do all sorts of cases. For example, we've tried a new technique where we use a juvenile's phone, where she's had these dates set up on her phone, and then set up dates with the guys posing as the juvenile, and when the guys show up, they get arrested. That's been pretty effective. I noticed that we're almost out of time, so I just wanted to give people my email address if they'd like to contact me. I know that there was a lot more questions. My email address is just my first name dot my last name at King County, one word spelled out, K-I-N-G, county.gov. So first name dot last name at kingcounty.gov.
All right, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Again, I want to let you know that if you did ask a question during this webinar that we did not have a chance to get you, we will provide a written response, and that will be listed in the archive. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Adam Ash.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly and Val and all of the participants for joining today and for the great presentation. We just have a few reminders as we close out that we have our archive on the online university at ojjdpou.org. We also want to provide technical information, contact information for INTAC, OJJDP, and NCJ FCJ, who was the host of today's webinar. And again, we want to remind you that the opinions expressed are those of the presenter and not reflective of any position at OJJDP. And finally, we would like to remind you to please take 5 minutes to complete the online evaluation and provide your feedback of today's event. And we hope that you have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us.